Well, a very good evening and welcome to this evening's episode of On the Record. My name is Vuyom Vog, and on tonight's show, Corruption Watch releases its annual report in which it details some of the work that has been done in the last year, including the types of complaints that have been received, painting a picture of corruption trends in the country. Well, it was in 2015 when Corruption Watch exceeded the 10,000 complaints mark. In 2015 alone, 2,382 reports were lodged with the institution. 71% of those complaints received fall under the description of corruption that the organization has adopted, which is the abuse of public resources or power for personal gain in any level of government or business. So for the fourth year running, Gauteng has topped the list of the highest number of complaints lodged with Corruption Watch, with 50% of all reported corruption coming from the province. The report points out, however, that this does not necessarily mean that Gauteng is the most corrupt province. The abuse of power takes up the lion's share when looking at the type of corruption reported. This is followed by bribery and procurement corruption. In 2015, schools were a major corruption hotspot with 16% of all complaints. Complaints of financial management, employment, corruption, and the theft of funds, among others. And of the reports received in the year under review, other hotspots included traffic and licensing, which makes up 12%, immigration at 6%, housing at 5%, and the bringing up of rare at 3%. Well, to talk more on the findings of the report, we are now joined here in the studio by the Executive Director of Corruption Watch, Mr. David Lewis. David, thanks very much for joining us and welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for your thanks.
Well, to quote your chairperson, it was the best of times, it was the worst of times. Of course, that coming from
make it up. Yeah.
Charles Dickens.
Yeah. Yes.
Was it really?
Well, he's my chairman, so I must agree with him. But I think he's right, actually. You know, it was the worst of times in the sense that there were some really, really ugly conflicts and some major problems in which not a great deal had been done to find resolution. But I think he means it was the best of times in that it was a time when I think South Africans really started to stand up against that which they found offensive and that which didn't meet their needs and their requirements and didn't give them what they had been promised. And corruption is one of them.
Let's talk a little bit about some of the specific incidents or cases that we are talking about, starting, of course, with the worst of times.
Well, you know, you see them across a variety of fronts. I mean, everybody knows about the big cases of grand corruption that have made the headlines, the Nkandlas, the Prasas, dare I say it, the SABCs. But, you know, equally damaging are the thousands of complaints documented in that report, which are licensing issues, corruption in the management of school resources, bribery on the roads, housing allocation. So, you know, across the spectrum, there is grand corruption, which I think really offends people in the sense that powerful people are seen to be getting away with things. And then there's petty corruption, which they encounter in their everyday lives and where they often make up their minds about the quality of the public service that they're dealing with.
But, okay, before we get to what I want to ask, let's then take just a sample of some of the best cases, the things that really gave you that sense that we are moving in the right direction.
You know, what gives us the best sense? There are two things that give us the best sense that we're moving in the right direction. The one is that people are standing up and they are complaining and they are reporting. And you know, what that indicates is that South Africans, unlike people in many other countries, South Africans have not accepted that corruption is a way of life, something that they just have to live with, like it or not. As with most things, South Africans are out there complaining, and that's necessary, and that's good. And the other good thing is that when I compare the situation now to 4 years ago, the response, and this is by no means universal, but it's noticeable, the response from many leading public sector individuals and the institutions that they represent is much more positive than it was 4 years ago. I come away from the end of last year feeling that there is, in key parts of the South African government and the South African political establishment, there are many people who are taking this issue very seriously now. And I like to think that we've played a small part in that, and I like to think the fact that people are complaining so vociferously has played a part in it. And I think that those two things, for me, represent the best of times.
Any particular individuals or organizations that really stood out and gave you or gave us all this, sense of hope?
Well, as you see from the report, one of our major campaigns this year has been schools. And we didn't make that up. I mean, when we first started asking people to report experiences of corruption, we got a surprising number of reports of corruption at schools, not in the Department of Education, in the management of school resources. And so we ran a campaign on that. And I have to say, we found the Gauteng Department of Education, starting with the MECs, but going through the department, incredibly willing to engage with us and willing to seek our assistance and our counsel, and willing to talk to us about their ideas. And so they have been a bit of a standout organization for us. At the other end of the spectrum, the Office of the Chief Procurement Officer in the Treasury is also an organization this is in the National Treasury. Okay. Is also the Gauteng Treasury have done some interesting things as well. But the Office of the Chief Procurement Officer in the National Treasury is at the other end of the spectrum, if you like, from the provincial department, really an agency that really gives you some confidence that at senior levels of government there is a willingness to engage with this. As I say, that's not universal, but it's there in enough quantity and enough quality to feel positive, actually.
Well, just, before we get into the detail of sort of both scenario, worst case and best case scenario, just if you could just take us through the methodology, how the information was compiled, how it was put together, what went into collating it, and up to the point of packaging it in the form of the report that you tabled today.
Our mission is to encourage the public to participate in combating corruption, and the principal means that we invite them to do that is by reporting experiences of corruption. And so we have a variety of reporting platforms, 7 or 8 different platforms, and people report their experiences onto that. I mean, we are not a police force, and we're an under-resourced NGO who can't, investigate anything more than a tiny fraction of the reports that we get. But what we do is that we analyze them in the form that you see here, and that what that comes to enable us to do is to understand what the patterns of corruption are and what the hotspots of corruption are. We then engage with the organizations in the public sector and in the private sector who are responsible for those areas. But principally, and very importantly, we also constantly report back to the public on what we do, the better to encourage them to share similar experiences that they identify. It also becomes the basis for deciding on litigation, for deciding on policy advocacy. But those reports are absolutely critical. I mean, not only are they our intelligence, but they are our legitimacy as well, because we can approach those in authority and say, this is what we've learned. We haven't made it up. We've got this evidence. There's 600 reports on education in Gauteng, on schools in Gauteng. We haven't investigated them all, but you've got a problem here because there's 600 people didn't collude in making something up. And that's what our modus operandi is, really.
But how then do you make the determination about whether things are looking better than they did the last time, or
it's very difficult to know that. And one of the reasons why it's very difficult to know that is that corruption by definition is a very underreported crime. It's usually the case that both parties in a corrupt deal are guilty of corruption. You may have your view about who is more guilty, but you know, a driver and a traffic cop are guilty of corruption when the so-called cool drink changes hands, just as the arms dealer and the procurement officer are also guilty of it. So it's not reported in the way that house robbery or homicide is reported. So it's always underreported. I mean, I think about that question, that what we know is that the level is too great for South Africans to be satisfied with, and that they're demonstrating. And that's enough for me. But we also do know that it really, in some places, it's really serious. I mean, amongst traffic cops, amongst licensing officials, it's damn near endemic. And the public procurement system has become riven with corruption. Again, I think that's a commonly accepted, admitted fact. And so we know where to go, but sometimes we don't. Like with the schools reports, we would never have focused there, but for the fact that people came out and told us that this was a huge problem.
David Lewis is, of course, the Executive Director of Corruption Watch, the organization that today tabled an annual report looking at corruption in our country. Well, we do have a person who will be joining us in the next segment, who comes from one organization that has been, let's call it the model citizen, certainly from what we're picking up from this report. And Opa Budibe from the Gauteng Department of Education will be joining us after this short ad break.
Technology isn't all scary. There's also fun stuff like gaming.
Lots of women do play games, whether it's on their phones or their tablets.
Then there are Africans who are using new tools to make other people's lives much easier.
We typed the whole CV on a small, QWERTY Nokia phone.
For all these and other technology and social media news, join me, Spumelele Zondi, every Sunday at 7:30 p.m. Central African Time on SABC News.
I'm Peter Ndoro.
And I'm Production Chetty Miller, SAB Miller, and Hauser Bush Imbev. It's something that I need to learn to say more often.
Will together produce around a third of the world's beer.
It is a mouthful. Have you ever considered skin bleaching?
Nigeria tops the list of African countries with 77% of its women bleaching their skin.
Now I can see that it is not good because it affects my face and some of my body parts.
Thousands of Arab Israelis and Palestinians participated in a big rally.
Flight MH17 was shot down by a Russian-made missile.
How those chips may fall is a prediction best left to the currency of time.
That's Primetime News, Africa Journal, and Your World on SABC News.
Welcome back. You're watching On the Record, and our topic for this evening, corruption, following the release today of a report by Corruption Watch. A report which, according to the organization, tells us that it was the best of times, but also the worst of times. Well, one organization that came out of this report smelling of roses, shall we say, is the Gauteng Department of Education. In 2015, schools in South Africa were a major corruption hotspot, with 16% of all complaints received. However, the Gauteng Department of Education demonstrated that with political will, but also with all the courage one can muster to really deal or focus on something, you can actually achieve quite a lot. And joining us here in the studio is Opa Budibe from the Gauteng Department of Education. Well, you guys must be proud of what you've done.
Well, let's first congratulate Corruption Watch for the work that it do. and we really appreciate the plaudits we're getting, but it also demonstrates that we're an organization that does not hide behind our finger when issues like this come up. We really tackle them head on.
What exactly did you do, or what measures did you put in place that made David Lewis and his colleague to think you are a model citizen?
Well, in the first instance, is the policies we have to detect and fight corruption, but actually also to take action whenever we find that somebody is doing corrupt acts, or several of our officials have had to be dismissed for corrupt acts. But whenever somebody comes to us and say we can, like Corruption Watch, there's a complaint about this matter, or any member of the public or the public protector for that matter, we cooperate and we really try to go to the bottom of the issue to investigate the matter up to its final conclusion.
Is cooperation, or lack of, would you say, the biggest problem?
It's a big problem,
when it comes to solving.
It's a big problem, and I think that Opa hits the nail on the head. I mean, the quality of the Gauteng Department of Education that we've respected is not that we always agree with each other. We don't actually, and we often have quite robust exchanges and disagreements. But it's their willingness to listen to a civil society organization, to take seriously what we're doing, and to treat us with respect. Some time ago, the Minister of National Education, for which I know he bears no responsibility, referred to civil society organizations as a disease. From the Gauteng Department of Education, as I say, we are not in bed with each other, but they respect what we say and we respect what they do. I mean, we still find some very frustrating things with the whole of the public sector. We are very frustrated by the length of time that it takes to go through disciplinary procedures and the delays and the people on suspensions forever. And we have some difficulties with the GDE on that front as well. But we are confident that we're treated with respect and we're treated with seriousness, and that's all. That's the baseline. I mean, what gets done after that are the interesting details. But it displays an attitude that I think takes these things seriously. And that's what has been demonstrated above all. I mean, it's not an unblemished record on their part or on our part, but we treat each other seriously.
Well, it does seem like, I mean, a lot of people, a lot of organizations seem to think that whenever the corruption is exposed, it's that becomes a blot, something negative, something that they don't want to have, and they end up sweeping things under the carpet as a result. Or if they don't do that, they end up not cooperating with organizations like Corruption Watch. Maybe, I mean, given how you have come out of this report, there's lessons to be learned here.
Well, it starts from the fact that you must recognize corruption is robbery, right? It's taking away what should have been spent for educating a child, and for personal and diverse resources, diverse attention. And if you decide to hide corruption, you are basically colluding in that act of robbing the child of a decent education. And so our attitude stems from that, and that's why we're very much interested in our internal systems. And I mean, the fact that we are a 39 billion rand system, 70,000 employees, and so forth. And many of the independent reports, even from the AG, and we are proud of that record, that sort of says that we manage the resources to the best of our ability and for the intended purposes. And so if corruption, we let corruption fester and become an institution that tolerates corruption, will not be able to achieve these records, will not be able to improve quality of education in this province.
The consequences of taking action. Remember, we're dealing with unions that at times can have enormous powers. One thinks of a province like the Eastern Cape, where they wield so much power, yet they are probably the biggest, villains in what is going on there. How much of a backlash do you get from?
Quite interesting. We get cooperation. We must also respect the fact that unions have a legitimate role to represent and protect their members. And to the extent that there has to be fair process, we accept that. But once a determination has been made, and two, that through a proper investigation, the allegation can be corroborated, we are uncompromising on that fact. And generally, the unions have not really, on genuine cases, tried to frustrate or block progress. But to the extent that, and I think this is quite frustrating to organizations like Corruption Watch, that unfortunately we have to follow due process, and that's regulated by law. You can't just accuse a person and then show them the door tomorrow. You can't just summarily dismiss. We have to give the party the opportunity to put the case. We have to investigate the matter, and it's also very obviously frustrating to us, but we have to follow that procedure.
Is it that much of a frustration to you, Dave, or does it depend on who you're dealing with? In other words, you adopt a different attitude if you're dealing with someone or people who you're seeing are willing to cooperate and take action when something is wrong. Or
yeah, no, of course. I mean, that makes all the difference. I mean, in relation to what Opa said, I think I respect the right of due process. I mean, after all, my very long background is in the union movement. I think, though, that there is an odd imbalance of power there. I mean, this is a subject for another day, maybe. But where I feel that, and I feel this about the public service generally, is that there's not sufficient urgency with which these matters are dealt. And so, I think this has ended in the Gauteng department, but where you had, people, disciplinary procedures taking so long that people got transferred to other schools where they just continue to do the same thing. And this is not unique to education by any stretch of the imagination. And so I think that's very frustrating. I mean, I think there's a way of exercising due process, but putting a lot of resources into the management of these disciplinary processes and managing them in an efficient, speedy, competent way and fair way. But it's like we always say about corruption. We say this about the president. We say this about the cabinet. There have to be consequences, and there have to be consequences at this level as well. And at the moment, for somewhat different reasons I'll give you, the consequences sometimes seem as difficult to extract when you're dealing with a teacher or a school governing body member as when you're dealing with the cabinet minister. And that's a problem. But I think it's a problem that's recognized, actually. And, oddly, there was a piece of legislation last year in which the then Minister of Public Service and Administration, Lindiwe Sisulu, introduced into a bill a provision that would have substantially eased the way of dealing with these things in the public sector, but it somehow has never really made it onto the statute books, which is something worth looking into, I think.
Well, that's what we're going to be talking about next. Well, Opa, before I release you, I mean, to your colleagues who have to play similar roles to yours, who have to speak for their organizations, who have to look after the image of their organizations, but also have to take into account, as you said previously, that stealing public money is stealing from our own future. What do we say to them?
Well, you can't hide corruption. You can't make a compromise on that. And actually, to try to spin yourself out of a story that's reflecting badly, it's not in the long-term interest. And I think we err on the side of saying let's expose these things, because part of the problem with corruption and any type of crime is that it happens in the dark, right? And if you don't expose one and deal with that, then it becomes a culture, and it becomes a situation where even the ordinary people make a bargain with it. So they sort of accept that to even get things that are legitimately due to them, they have to pay officials. So we cannot accept a situation where we must hide and not because we are trying to protect few officials who, in the first instance, are acting against the interest of the organization, right? So we must always act in a way that protects what is in the interest of the children of South Africa, which is quality of education.
Opawetibela, thank you very much for blessing us with your presence. Well, there you have it. If you work for government or any organization for that matter, just do remember that hiding corruption or sweeping it under the carpet is really not helping your organization. You are stealing, you're taking away from our collective future. Well, after the break, we are joined by someone who has been in this space, part of initiatives that involved civil society, the government, the private sector, in trying to deal with this scourge. But have those initiatives worked? And where they haven't, what have been the problems? And perhaps more importantly, how do we make sure that we turn the situation around and all of us refocus on what we need to focus on, and that is dealing with this scourge of corruption. We're taking another quick ad break. After the break, this conversation continues.
Get all the latest news from the SABC's online news services on our website. Breaking news and in-depth coverage of everything from business, sports to politics and lifestyle. Catch the top news clips and watch live streaming of major news events on the SABC News YouTube channel whenever. Stay connected on the SABC News Facebook page and have your say on news that matters to you. And for the latest headlines and live updates from our reporters, follow us on Twitter. SABC Digital News, anytime, anywhere.
Controlesa is actually stirring the pot here.
I'm sure they've been consulted as Controlesa. They did not see a snake. Now that in certain areas there are certain benefits that might possibly be accruing, there is a snake, now we need to reverse the process.
I agree, but it is not above the sovereignty of the people. The very same court you're talking about.
The sovereignty of the people, probably you should explain that to me.
The sovereignty of the people is above everything.
It is not proper the way facts are presented to the public. Are you in contact with Khosekgolo Motshodi?
He was kicked out by the court because he wanted to be amicus curiae.
For your weekly dose of all things legal, join Dumile Mateza every Sunday at 2 p.m. only on SABC News Channel.
Welcome back. You're watching On the Record, and our topic this evening, corruption in South Africa, following, of course, the release today of a report by Corruption Watch, a report that found that, well, the past year has been the worst of times, but also the best of times, borrowing, of course, from Charles Dickens. Well, civil society has always had a role to play when it comes to whistleblowing in order to create an environment where corruption can be dealt with and addressed with. Well, Nkosikhulule Nyembezi has been an activist for many, many years, representing civil society in fora that included the government, that also included the private sector. And he joins us now for some insights and perspective given. Well, Mr. Nyembezi, you heard what Corruption Watch has said. What do you make of the report, or what the report says? Are you surprised? Are you happy? Just from the work that people like you have had to put in over the years, what do you think, and how do you feel when you hear what Corruption Watch told us today?
Oh yes, good evening. It's a very big congratulations to Corruption Watch for the work that they have done. It's always exciting to observe what comes out of these reports and to understand the amount of time and energy that has been put in trying to shine some light into deep issues that we are faced with. So it's a big congratulations. And of course, the fact that it focuses on education is also an important issue, in the sense that last year we had a fresh election of school governing bodies, and the issues around fighting corruption, educating community members what corruption is about, it seems to be paying off. And what I would like to see is for this report to be popularized, so that even in other provinces, even in other corners of the country, people can get to know that there are lessons to be learned, so that in the end of the day we can have an environment where people know that the possibility of being detected when you when you commit corruption, and the possibility of being prosecuted and convicted is real, so that can serve as a deterrent.
Well, some years ago, I mean, you were among the representatives of civil society that were part of a much bigger initiative that included the government, that included the private sector, also called the Anti-Corruption Forum. What became of that initiative? On a day like this, one can't help but go back to such initiatives.
Well, the National Anti-Corruption Forum still exists. It is not as strong as it is supposed to be, but what is still encouraging is to see that civil society on its own continues to do some work to combat corruption. Government continues to do some work to combat corruption in the form of amending and reviewing policy and legislation, in the form of introducing new measures, including centralization of the procurement processes, as well as the private sector. I think what the call is now is for all these sectors to come back around the table and ensure that there is synergy in the work that they do, because it does show that we still have a long way to go. And in fact, the fact that a Corruption Watch report focuses on schools is also important, because in order for us to overcome this problem of corruption, we need to emphasize on educating the public that these are the rights, these are the issues and challenges that we are faced with, and this is a way to deal with the problems where it occurs, so as to emphasize on that strategy and that call to say we must have a zero tolerance on corruption, and schools and education environment is a good environment to start.
David Lewis, I mean, your take on why the bond, you know, that was formed, you know, between civil society, the government, and the private sector has basically, Ms. Nyembezi, I think, is being very modest here. I think it has fallen apart for all intents and purposes.
No, I think it has as well, and I think the reason for it, and I mean, I remember attending, as Nyembezi did, the last annual meeting of the National Anti-Corruption Forum, and you know, it was my first one. It was probably his third one, I would think, and I, you know, got the idea that the only part of that bargain that treated the issue seriously was civil society, actually, and who came to it with any energy was civil society. I think government and the private sector did not treat it seriously. I mean, just as one example, I remember that one of the sort of rules of the National Anti-Corruption Forum was that the government should be represented by the president. In fact, government was represented by a deputy minister whose anti-corruption credentials, let's say, are not firmly established. So government was represented at a very low level, business was represented at a very low level, and civil society...
It was not, I think to some, it was not Business Against Crime, something like that.
It might have been, and Business Against Crime are a good organization, but it wasn't the leadership of business. It wasn't the leadership of the business sector, of the business community. I think that now, if somebody would go and bell the cat, as people say, that I think that everybody would take this a lot more seriously. I mean, my sense is that, you know, as I said when we were speaking earlier, that I think both business, both government and business, by no means universally, but in enough important pockets, are much more concerned about the threat that corruption represents now than they were 3-4 years ago, however long ago it was that the last National Anti-Corruption Forum meeting took place. So I think, yeah, we need somebody with Nyembezi's staying power to go and try and revive this again, and we would support that, no doubt about it.
Mr. Nyembezi, I mean, just your take on why things aren't what everyone dreamt or thought they would be by now, but especially given what Mr. Lewis says is actually that there is an appetite, you know, for this, and government was like, where did things fall apart? What went wrong?
A number of things went wrong in the sense that, for example, government is led by the Department of Public Service and Administration in that forum. And you find that there has been a high turnover by way of ministers and other high officials from the time of Minister Padeyache and the time of Minister Sisulu, and then we had Minister Shabane, and I mean, we've had a lot of faces changing, and in fact, we look forward to the budget vote this year to see what Minister Ramatrodi has in place, because there has been some talk that we need to revive the structure, especially because the Treasury and other departments see the need now to work in that space. But also in the civil society, there has been some problems. You will know that the anti-corruption network, the National Anti-Corruption Forum, is chaired by a civil society member in the name of Zolezi Mavavi. But because of the problems that have been there that led to his removal from the COSATU office, we haven't seen traction as we would have found. So even on the side of civil society, we need to take responsibility to ensure that the things come together again. But it need not just be about palace politics and at a high level concentration only, but it should be a message that goes down to ordinary citizens to say we must have a zero tolerance to corruption, and we must use the facilities that are available in the form of Corruption Watch, in the form of hotlines, and we must learn from the lessons that we have gathered over the past years to see what works best, so that we can draw from those best practices to fight corruption wherever it exists.
David, politics,
yeah,
and how they can kill some of the most noble initiatives we can ever, put together.
No, I mean, Nyembezi's analysis is undoubtedly correct, and I'm pleased that he said it. But it's undoubtedly correct. I mean, I sometimes think that we South Africans are guilty of looking only for the grand gestures and the big stages, sometimes before we've put the blocks in place. And I think that since then, many more blocks have been put in place. I mean, we're an organization that is focused on dealing with corruption, but his old organization, the Black Sash, I remember meeting with them over the social grants corruption or maladministration scandal, and they were doing some things and we were doing other things. There are a range of sectoral organizations now, some in health, some in education, others in other specialist sectors, in nuclear procurement, who are all doing work that in one way or another touches on the corruption issue. And so I think that from civil society's perspective, the building blocks are much more in place. I mean, that having been said, civil society tends to be a fractious, argumentative bunch, but I think that there's good reason to, as are business, I'm afraid, and frankly, so are government. But I mean, there's good reason for bringing those elements together in what I think is much more universally recognized as a, something approximating to a national crisis. And there are many people in government who are saying that. Civil society have said that for a long time. And I think it really hit business between the eyes on the 9th of December last year. And I think we must take advantage of their newfound recognition of the scale of this problem.
But what has made initiatives like Corruption Watch work? In other words, what lessons have organizations like you learned from previous initiatives, experience, and from engaging also with the personalities that have been involved in this space? But for instance, someone like Zwelin Zimmerwab is now part of Corruption Watch. Yeah. But we know that the problems that Mr. Nyembezi mentioned, that even though he was supposed to be overall the guy who drives the ship, but because of the politics of the day and everything that goes with that, this initiative has suffered. Yeah. But what have you learned as Corruption Watch, that which the next time around, if this thing comes together again, you'll be able to share with everyone?
Difficult to put into practice, but I think we have been accused by every political party and by every faction of the trade union movement of supporting every other faction of the trade union movement or every other faction of the political organizations. But in fact, we have been conscientiously non-partisan. And I wish that this could be viewed as precisely that, as a non-partisan issue. I think that's very important because, there's no doubt about it that opposition political parties will try and capitalize on it, and the government will get defensive about it.
But
the ruling party will
get a reason not to do the right thing.
It's not a good enough reason not to do the right thing, and there's that. And the second thing I think that we've learned, which is controversial, is that you must be prepared to examine all your old ways of doing things, even the old ways that we won the struggle. Now have to change in the days of social media, a generation, a post-struggle generation. You've got to talk in different language, different symbols, different approaches. And I think we've really tried to do that. Not always successfully, but we've tried to adopt a modern 21st century South African view of things. And what I'm pleased to say is that the people that we're getting the most traction from are in fact young people, but they speak a very different language to that of their elders. And one thing that they do say that is different to their elders is that we can beat this. The youth, for whatever reason, have never seen a problem that they can't solve. And you've got to start off with that kind of arrogant attitude, if you like, to the problem if you're going to solve it. And we must engage with them. Many of these forums, you look at these forums, the sort of average age is like 50 or something, We've got to change some of those ways of doing things as well, not only rely on old dogs like Nyembezi and myself to get this stuff done,
Well, we're going to take another quick ad break. This conversation, of course, continues. But perhaps for the record, I should state that we did invite government, and there were some people who felt there were pockets of excellence, and that the work that is happening in those areas perhaps needed to be, brought to, the public's attention. But bureaucracy and other things, to cut a long story short, we're told that at some point in the near future, the people responsible for all these initiatives that the crime and security cluster, for example, is involved in, will come and talk about what they are doing, but certainly not today.
Preparing for victory requires intense effort and teamwork. When you get to it, there is no turning back, because all eyes are on you. When it's action time, nothing should stand in your way. Sports Live tackles and analyzes all the sport action. This is the home of all your sport news, updates, and more. Sports Live weekdays at 8:30 p.m.
SABC News, we report, contextualize and present news and current affairs honestly, fairly and fully. We consider it a duty to provide consistent, relevant, useful and top quality information and analysis. Our mission is to provide credible, accurate and interesting news programming, bringing news into everyone's homes in everyone's languages. Thank you, South Africa, for relying on SABC News for quality news output and for making us your #1 source of information. SABC News, Africa's news leader.
Welcome back. We are on our last segment of the program, and the topic this evening, corruption in South Africa, following the release of a report by Corruption Watch, a report that basically said, well, we've done quite a lot, but there are also areas or things that we should be depressed about and frown upon. Well, Mr. Nyembezi, just to come back to you, well, civil society itself hasn't been without challenges or without problems. Just take us through some of the things that you've seen which, given just how civil society has actually been ironically critical in the fight. We're not saying government or the business, as David has said, is not also doing its part, but we are acknowledging the fact that civil society has taken a leadership role until, of course, we are told otherwise. Where do you think we need to strengthen the efforts of civil society collectively to make sure that civil society once again takes that leadership role and takes the battle back to business and to the government?
Well, I think it's about using the mileage that we already have. For example, this report that has been released that covers a number of areas to say how can we then affirm what Corruption Watch has done and look at ways of replicating that, or in terms of saying whatever has been uncovered, how do we make sure that it is known in all the corners of the country? So, I mean, the challenge would be to democracy supporting institutions that we find in our constitution, the Public Protector, the Human Rights Commission, the Gender Commission, Auditor General. It would be good for us as civil society to sit around the table with those institutions to see how can we bring up momentum in this fight against corruption. Also knowing that if in the work that they do to investigate, those that investigate, it is basically between government departments and government departments. And so civil society still comes in to ensure that private sector is also covered. Because, for example, one of the main contentions is around tenders that government issues to private companies to make service delivery. And then where there is corruption in that area, you find that the Public Protector or the Auditor General cannot investigate. And so civil society needs to come in. And also, as I said, with the new minister, Ramatlodi, and the cluster that he leads in government, it is time now to find each other and see what is it that we can do, especially because this year it's an election year at a local government level, and it is taking place during the time when the municipalities have got to adopt and spend new budgets. How do we make sure that this time around money is not spent on pet projects that are meant to influence voters and attract and increase the fortunes of political parties? Those are the things that we need to focus on, that will take on the confidence of everyone led by the civil society. And if I could mention trade unions, we have seen, for example, in terms of how the trade unions defended the decisions that were taken or were not taken at NEDLEC when it came to those to the new pension act, in terms of how money should be spent, and to say that government cannot just bulldoze decisions that were not taken at NEDLEC. So it is around that we need to convene and ensure that we work, because COSATU has got strong voice in unions that work for government. And so if those messages can be taken, the Batupele principle can well be implemented.
But how do we get around, I mean, some of the problems we've seen coming through? You cited as an example, you know, the new pension laws, and COSATU was unequivocal, you know, about that. But COSATU can double speak at the worst of times, you know, and you don't know what would have happened. I mean, if you go back also to I mean, institutions that you mentioned, Chapter 9 institutions. The public protector may be in a category, you know, of her own, but some of the other institutions have all the, you know, the power and the powers that are conferred on them by the constitutions, but they are quiet and can be tardy. I mean, if you look at some of the things that are happening, I mean, look at the racism stuff that's been going on. I don't know what, or if even the Human Rights Commission is on top of that situation and doing what it is supposed to do. Still waiting for, you know, the report on the King, you know, in KZN and the remarks that he made, and all that sort of stuff. But how do we deal with sometimes constitutionally and actually empowered institutions or organizations like COSATU that have a muscle, but which can, you know, which disappear just when you need them?
I think what should be the underlying principle is that we need to take a human rights approach in dealing with the fight against corruption, and not use politics which are divisive to set the agenda, because the human rights approach is the one that says all these issues are mutually reinforcing in terms of the rights that the state must protect, in terms of that the rights that individuals must protect, as well as the responsibilities that we must all shoulder. And we can do that without falling into the trap of what are the politics of the day and what is the flavor of the politics of the day. The point that was made as a lesson from this report in terms of how Corruption Watch worked with the Department of Education, where they did not always agree in terms of the approach to be taken, but they managed to come from different positions and find each other. It's something that we need to emphasize on. But also to say that I mean, everybody must wake up to the reality that corruption is a problem for us all, and we need to hit early and hit hard. And so educating everyone about what needs to be done is also one way of generating interest, because some people are just too scared. For example, we come from a culture where whistleblowing and methods of reporting corruptions are not integrated and synergized. So you find that somebody who comes forward to report a case, they happen to report it in the correct department, I mean in the wrong department. And so it is found that no, you are supposed to report this in this department, and therefore you are not protected by what is supposed to be the law that is supposed to be protecting you, and that discourages people. So insofar as we need to work to harmonize the institutions and methods of reporting, we need to work to harmonize so that the left hand knows what the right hand is doing. That is the way to go. And talking about the Chapter 9 institutions, we must say yes, the Human Rights Commission is dealing with the issue of of racism. So it's about also educating the public that this is what they are doing. But because the Corruption Watch has taken an interesting step to say, for example, with the replacement of the public protector, the public must get involved in terms of nominating who should be the next public protector. We need to take that right across. Early in April, there will be hearings by the Judicial Services Commission in terms of appointment of judges. We need the public voice there. There are some commissioners in the Electoral Commission and the Human Rights Commission that need to be replaced. We need to have public nominating those people and have a voice so that we can carry on with the confidence that we have in those institutions.
Mr. Nyembezi, very, very briefly, Dave, how confident are you that this fight will go on with or without maximum cooperation
I'm
from
pretty confident.
the government and the private sector?
I mean, I think that civil society is actually also a much more robust animal now than it was 4 years ago. I mean, in this area, for example, I think there's a real role for the churches to play, and the churches have been very sleepy for the last 15 years or so, but they seriously are waking up now. And because there's an inevitable ethical and moral dimension to fighting corruption, which I mean, I don't feel comfortable preaching that to other people, but an archbishop can, you know, and I think that that they need to really also step up around this issue. And so I think that I am pretty confident, although it's these grand alliances are hard to keep together, but we need to do so.
Mr. Lewis, Mr. Nyembezi, thank you very much for joining us this evening.
Thank you very much. Until next time.
Well, that's all we have time for on tonight's episode of On the Record. Do join us again tomorrow night. And from all of us here, it's a good night.